Hi, ACES102. I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the tragedy of the commons and use it as an example so that you can take some ideas away as you work on this last system archetype homework assignment. What is the key about the tragedy of the commons here? Well, in general, if you're not already familiar about it, uh, a key way to think about it is it's a mismatch between total activity and a resource. Basically, the total activity in a given area starts to exceed what the resource can provide, even if it's a renewable resource. Now, what drives that activity? Well, that's up here in these loops. Several individuals are all consuming the resource. They're taking away from the resource. They're gaining from it. They're benefiting from it. Generally, we talk about profit, money, in these situations, although it probably could be considered others from other perspectives as well. What drives it is here. So as A does more things to work towards making profit, he gains more. But eventually that gain allows him to invest and intensify their activity, creating a reinforcing loop above. It's important to remember, before I continue that really, in this particular archetype, we're only drawing two individuals, but there's probably the potential for an infinite number of loops, other individuals that is, all consuming from the same resource. The problem generally comes when there's too many of them. So let me use an example to help to delve into this further. Imagine Fred and Ted, they're both fishermen. Remember Fred and Ted from the storybooks when we were young kids? I read these, I read them in Spanish and in English. The story's the same. They generally don't share well, right? Well, that's what's happening here in the tragedy of the commons. As Fred and Ted intensify their activity, they catch more fish, and that's great. But this delay here, that's what the hashes remember. That's what those hashes mean. Start to drive down. Notice the opposing relationship. Start to drive down the potential profit that they can make per fish. Okay? Per fish. That's supply and demand. As the suppliers increase their activity and provide more product, generally per product they sell them for lower prices. And that's juxtaposed against the supply side, where the available fish also have an influence on profit for fish caught. And here's the challenge, right? Here's our real challenge. Now, how do we break this loop? That's where these opposing relationships are there, but how do we break this particular loop? If you do the reading, they really talk about three key ways to break this loop. Educate, privatize, or regulate. Let's talk about educate first, okay? We're going to make these fishermen smarter. That's exactly what happened in those books, wasn't it? And that. Fred and Ted, somehow they could get smarter and be better about fishing. The key thing to teach them, of course, is to make them understand what the resource availability is. But given education, we have to assume that Fred and Ted can be smarter fishermen, and there's some influence there. This is a tricky one. Depending on, if you know that they're fishing too much, we have to convince them that it's okay, that it's best for their long-term interest to fish less. And that would suggest that this is probably some sort of an opposing relationship there. And they could manage the way that they fish in this particular fishery and avoid the collapse of the fishery. Now, in truth, if they fish better, they might also do a better job, and there's probably ways that you can even make those be supporting relationships. Let's talk about some of the other examples. Privatize. What does privatize mean? Well, effectively, either Fred or Ted, they buy the fishery or buy a portion of the fishery or some combination, and they only use that portion of the fishery. In fisheries, that's a little tricky because the fish, they might swim away, right? And so it might be hard to picture fishermen purchasing a fishery. But remember the tragedy of the commons story, the original version of the tragedy of the commons story. It's a little bit easier to think about people buying a plot of land and only utilizing that plot of land, not sharing it like we did in the open field agricultural system that we had in feudal times. If that were true, what you do on your area doesn't impact anybody else, and you suffer either the profits or the losses due to those actions. Diagrammatically here, effectively, when you privatize, you're removing these relationships. Fred can fish alone, and he doesn't have to worry about Ted's activity, and whatever he does only impacts him and nobody else. Of course, he could fish himself to no fish, and then he's not going to be doing very well. Uh, Presumably, Ted is either going to buy another portion of the fishery or a completely separate fishery someplace else, and that's another way to think about this particular system, and a decent way to solve it too. And we've seen this practice in a few instances. What about regulate? Actually, regulate, we see this one the most often, don't we? We agree to either a tax or an incentive that will influence your profit and presumably influence the way you fish. That goes up here. I'll write the word regs. Okay? And we'll then for influence the profits, I'll draw it from this side. Okay, and let me put a little curve in there just to keep it consistent. Those regs, those regulations, they might actually, this is another example where it could be supporting or opposing depending on the specific regulation. You can imagine supporting regulations. I'll put a plus sign for that. It's a little easier. Oops. To represent a supporting relationship. And the idea is that you'll reward someone like Ted who fishes the right way, that avoids some of the negative impacts on the resource. Or you might do the opposite up above, because Fred, whatever activity he's doing, or have some especially negative impacts on the fishery, and will try to oppose us. So he'll get some sort of a tax or some combination in practice. Focusing on the individuals that focus on what are the right practices for your particular tragedy of the commons, and hopefully avoiding the collapse in the long run. I hope this is helpful. Do let me know if you have any questions anytime.